The bell above the door jingled, cutting through the heavy scent of decaying lignin and stale black tea. I kept my head bowed over the workbench, rubbing a thumb coated in dried iron gall ink across the frayed spine of an 1890 encyclopedia. My son, Mark, didn't bother taking off his synthetic leather shoes. He just marched to the counter, bringing with him the sharp, chemical stink of cheap cologne and desperation. "You're too senile to manage this dusty old shop, Dad," Mark sneered, slapping a thick stack of papers onto the glass display case. "So the judge and I already signed the foreclosure and power of attorney papers." He waved the forged document in my face, a smug, predatory grin stretching across his jaw. "Sign the transfer, or I'll have the court declare you incompetent by Friday." I adjusted my thick wire-rimmed reading glasses and let my hands tremble just enough to sell the act. I squinted at the page, shuffling my feet in my worn slippers, playing the doddering, confused old man he so desperately needed me to be. But behind the thick lenses, my eyes weren't failing. They were scanning. 30 years as Interpol's top document forgery expert doesn't just fade when you retire to sell used paperbacks. I didn't just see my signature on that page. I saw the microkerning errors between the R and the I. I saw the asymmetrical electrostatic toner spray on the bottom margin, a dead giveaway of the specific commercial laser printer sitting in his downtown office. I felt the tacky resistance of the cheap copy paper, entirely wrong for illegal filing. He thought he was stealing a prime piece of downtown real estate from a dying old man. He thought he had won. I let the silence hang, breathing in the smell of old binding glue, while I calculated the exact tensile strength of the rope I was about to tie around his neck. I reached out with my calloused, ink-stained fingers and tapped the paper. "All right, Mark," I mumbled, letting my voice crack with manufactured defeat. "Take it to the court." He snatched the papers back, laughing as he turned for the door. He had no idea he was holding his own death warrant. I watched him walk out into the afternoon sun, my pulse steady, my mind already mapping the network architecture of his office. The old man was dead. The ink master was back. The heavy oak door clicked shut, severing the noise of the street outside. The brass bell above it gave one last, pathetic jingle before settling into dead silence. I stood behind the counter, listening to the retreating squeak of Mark's synthetic leather shoes fading down the pavement. I didn't move until the sound was entirely gone, swallowed by the hum of the city. Only then did I let my shoulders drop. The manufactured tremor in my hands vanished. I reached up, adjusted my thick wire-rimmed magnifiers, and flipped the open sign in the window to closed. The shop smelled of decaying lignin, vanilla-tinged dust, and the sharp acidic tang of old binding glue. It was the smell of slow, quiet death. Mark hated it. He called it the smell of failure. He didn't understand that paper has a memory, and right now the paper on my desk was screaming at me. I walked over to the glass display case, where he had slapped the forged power of attorney and foreclosure papers. He had taken the originals, but, in his arrogance, he had left the carbon copy of the deed transfer on the glass, assuming my failing eyes wouldn't notice the faint blue impression. I pulled my brass-handled magnifying loupe from the pocket of my frayed tweed cardigan. The metal was warm from my body heat, heavy and solid in my palm. I leaned over the glass, bringing the loupe to my eye. Under the 10x magnification, the lie broke down into its component parts. A wet ink signature bleeds into the paper fibers, creating microscopic feathering at the edges. This signature was perfectly crisp. It was printed, not signed. But Mark wasn't stupid enough to just print a signature. He had used a high-resolution flatbed scanner to lift my signature from a 10-year-old lease agreement, then pasted it into the digital document. What he didn't account for was the microkerning. The space between the R and the I in Harrison was exactly 0.04 millimeters too wide. The software he used to stitch the image together had warped the baseline by a fraction of a degree. I moved the loupe down to the bottom margin of the page. There it was, the electrostatic toner spray. It was asymmetrical, heavier on the left side, with a distinct repeating pattern of microscopic cyan dots every 3.2 millimeters. That wasn't a standard office printer. That was the specific, flawed drum unit of the HP LaserJet Enterprise M600 series, sitting in the back hallway of his downtown real estate office. The cyan cartridge was leaking just enough to leave a ghost image on every page it spit out. I let the silence hang in the empty shop, breathing in the dust. I took a slow breath, letting the cold reality of what he was doing settle into my bones. He wasn't just trying to sell the building. The loan documents attached to the carbon copy showed a $500,000 predatory lien against the 99-year lease. He was bleeding the property dry to pay off his own debts, and he was using my name to do it. Layer 1 of my mind registered the sheer, blinding arrogance of the boy I had raised. Layer 2 locked in the calculated vow that I would dismantle his life brick by brick. But Layer 3, the deep, quiet layer that had spent 3 decades hunting counterfeiters across Europe, was already looking at the hidden truth. The printer was the weak link. The printer was the witness. I walked to the back of the shop, past the towering shelves of first editions and the towering stacks of damaged paperbacks waiting for repair. I unlocked the heavy steel door that led to the basement. The air down here was different. It was cool, dry, and smelled of ozone and hot silicon. This was my sanctuary. The public saw a doddering old man who glued spines and brewed stale black tea. They didn't see the server racks humming in the corner, or the high-resolution forensic scanners sitting next to the 19th century cast-iron book press. I sat at my workbench and pulled a small black USB drive from a locked drawer. I had written the payload on it 3 years ago, just in case I ever needed to ghost a machine. It was a firmware exploit designed to bypass the administrative lock on commercial laser printers. I plugged it into my laptop, bringing up the network topology of Mark's office. He used a cheap, off-the-shelf mesh router. The password was his dog's name and his birth year. He really was a cowardly fraud. I compiled the code, embedding the specific UV-reactive micro watermark I wanted. Every time the printer's fuser rolled a piece of paper through, it would now lay down a microscopic layer of invisible ink in the cyan channel. To the naked eye, it was blank. Under a 365-nanometer ultraviolet light, it would glow with the words fraudulent diagment, followed by a unique time-stamped hash code. I packed the USB drive into my canvas tote, threw on my coat, and walked out the back alley door. The walk to Mark's office took 20 minutes. The city was loud, a chaotic mess of sirens and exhaust fumes, but I kept my head down, shuffling my feet just enough to maintain the illusion of the frail old man. Mark's office was in a glass-fronted building that smelled of floor wax and ambition. The plaque on the door read Sterling & Son Development. The irony of the name tasted like copper in my mouth. I pushed through the glass doors. The receptionist, a young woman named Chloe, who always looked at me with a mixture of pity and impatience, looked up from her monitor. "Mr. Harrison," she said, her voice dropping an octave into that condescending tone people use for toddlers and the elderly. "Mark is in a meeting. Can I help you?" I gave her a confused, watery smile, clutching my canvas tote to my chest. "I just brought him his lunch, dear, and some old tax files he asked for. I know he's busy. I'll just leave them in the copy room." She hesitated, then sighed, waving a hand toward the back hallway. "Fine. Just don't interrupt him. He's on a very important call with the bank." I shuffled past her desk, my worn slippers silent on the plush carpet. The back hallway was empty. The copy room was a small, windowless closet that smelled sharply of hot plastic, cheap carpet cleaner, and the distinct, sharp tang of the leaking cyan toner. The HP LaserJet sat on a sturdy table, humming softly in sleep mode. I set my tote down and pulled out the USB drive. I reached around the back of the machine, finding the maintenance port hidden behind the network interface card. I plugged the drive in. The printer's small LCD screen flickered, cycling from blue to amber. I held my breath, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3. The screen flashed green. Firmware update complete. The machine rebooted, the internal rollers spinning up with a heavy, mechanical clunk. I pulled the drive out, slipped it back into my pocket, and grabbed a blank sheet of paper from the tray. I hit the print test page button on the control panel. The machine whirred, spitting out a page with a grid of colors and text. I held it up to the fluorescent light. It looked perfectly normal. But I knew what was hidden in the cyan layer. I folded the test page, slipped it into my coat, and walked out of the office, giving Chloe a polite nod as I left the building. The trap was set. Now, the hardest part of any operation began, the waiting. People ask me how I didn't lose my mind during those next 3 weeks. You ever watch a spider build a web? You don't swat it while it's spinning the anchor threads. You wait until the fly is wrapped tight, until it's completely immobilized. Have you ever had to sit on your hands, smiling and nodding, while someone you loved dug their own grave? It takes a certain kind of stomach. It requires you to kill the father and let the forensic examiner take the wheel. I spent my days in the shop, repairing bindings, brewing my stale black tea and playing the part. I let my hands shake when I handed customers their change. I let myself forget the names of the regulars. I became the ghost Mark needed me to be. But at night, when the shop was locked and the streetlights cast long, yellow shadows across the floorboards, I went down to the basement. I sat in front of my monitors, watching the network traffic from Mark's office. I had installed a SAF packet sniffer on his router. I couldn't read the encrypted contents of his files, but I could see the metadata. I could see the print spooler logs. Every night at 11 p.m., the printer would wake up. I watched the data packets flow. I saw the file names flash across my secondary monitor: estate transfer gable.docx, frivish hendersonal.ts. He wasn't just forging my documents, he was running a mill. I leaned back in my chair, the leather creaking in the quiet basement. The glow of the monitors reflected off my thick glasses. I rubbed my calloused thumbs together, feeling the permanent ridges of ink stains in my skin. This was bigger than a $500,000 loan on a bookstore. This was a systemic ring. He was targeting the most vulnerable people in the county. The isolated, the forgotten, the ones who didn't have families to check on them, or whose families were too busy to look closely at the paperwork. I needed to know who was rubber stamping these forged deeds. A forged power of attorney is just a piece of paper until a judge validates it. I pulled up the county public records database on my main screen. I cross-referenced the names from Mark's print logs with the court filings. Every single one of those estate transfers, every single one of those predatory loans had been approved by the same magistrate. Judge Arthur Sterling. I knew the name. Everyone in the city knew the name. Sterling was a pillar of the legal community. He gave speeches at charity galas. He sat on the board of the local historical society. He presented himself as a stern, respectable guardian of the law. But looking at the timestamps on the court dockets, a different picture emerged. Sterling was approving these complex estate transfers in under 4 minutes. No hearings, no independent legal representation for the elderly plaintiffs. Just a quick signature and a filing fee. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't used in 5 years. It rang 3 times before a heavy, gravelly voice answered. Harrison, the voice said. It was Dubois, my old liaison at Interpol's forgery division in Lyon. I was wondering when you would call. I saw the obituary for your wife. I am sorry, my friend. Thank you, Marcel. I said, my voice flat, devoid of the trembling tremor I used in the shop. I need a favor. I need you to run a deep background check on a local magistrate, Judge Arthur Sterling, and I need you to pull the financial records for a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands called Sterling Holdings. There was a pause on the line. I heard the faint strike of a match, the smell of burning tobacco almost translating through the receiver. A judge, Dubois said. You are playing a dangerous game, Harrison. If he is dirty, he will have friends in high places. He's taking a 30% cut on stolen estates, I said. He's working with my son. Another long pause. Send me the docket numbers, Dubois said softly. I will have the financials by Friday. I hung up and turned back to the monitors. The printer in Mark's office was spitting out another document. I stared at the file name. The cold, mechanical reality of it washed over me. He wasn't just taking the building. He was preparing to take my freedom. If I fought the foreclosure, if I showed up to court and proved I was lucid, he would lose everything. The only way to ensure the transfer went through uncontested was to have me declared legally incompetent. He was going to lock me in a psychiatric ward. I let the silence hang in the basement, the hum of the server racks filling the void. I took a slow breath, feeling the chill of the concrete floor seeping through my slippers. I didn't feel fear. I felt the cold, hard clarity of a man who has just been handed the exact weapon he needs to execute his enemy. Thursday afternoon, the bell above the shop door jingled. I was at the counter, carefully applying a layer of wheat starch paste to the torn spine of a 1920s apple. I didn't look up immediately. I finished the stroke, laid the brush down, and wiped my hands on a rag before raising my head. Mark walked in, and he wasn't alone. Judge Sterling was with him. The contrast between the two men was stark. Mark was wearing a suit that was too shiny, his tie knotted too tight, his eyes darting around the shop with barely concealed disgust. Judge Sterling, on the other hand, was a picture of established wealth. He wore a heavy charcoal wool suit that draped perfectly over his broad shoulders. His silver hair was impeccably styled, and he carried the faint, expensive scent of peppermint and aged scotch. He looked like a man who owned the world and was merely tolerating the rest of us. "Dad," Mark said, his voice loud and overly cheerful, the kind of voice you use when you're talking to a deaf person. "Look who stopped by. Judge Sterling. He's a friend of mine from the Rotary Club Butub." I blinked, letting my mouth hang open slightly. I wiped my paste-covered hands on my frayed tweed cardigan, leaving a faint white smear on the wool. "Oh," I mumbled, squinting through my thick lenses. "Hello. Can I help you find a book?" Judge Sterling smiled. It was a practiced politician's smile that didn't reach his cold, gray eyes. "No, thank you, Mr. Harrison. I was just telling your son what a wonderful piece of history this building is. It's a shame to see it falling into disrepair." He walked over to a shelf of leather-bound encyclopedias, running a manicured finger along the spines. He didn't pull a book out. He just touched them, as if checking for dust. "Mark tells me you're having a hard time keeping up with the maintenance." "It's a lot of stairs," I said, letting my voice crack. "And the roof leaks when it rains." Mark stepped closer, clapping a heavy hand on my shoulder. I suppressed the urge to drive my binding awl through the back of his hand. "That's exactly what we were talking about, Dad. The judge here has some connections with the City Historical Society. They might be able to take the building off your hands. Give you a nice, quiet place to live out your retirement. Somewhere with nurses. Somewhere you don't have to worry about the roof." I looked from Mark to the judge. They were standing in my shop, surrounded by the accumulated knowledge of centuries, discussing my life like I was a piece of broken furniture they were planning to haul to the dump. "I like my shop," I said, injecting a note of stubborn, senile defiance into my voice. "I don't want to move." Judge Sterling chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Of course you don't, Arthur. Change is hard at our age. But sometimes the law has to step in to protect people from their own stubbornness. Mark is just looking out for your best interests." The judge turned to Mark, his voice dropping slightly, though he clearly didn't care if I heard. "Have the orderlies finalized the transport logistics for next week? We need to make sure the transition is seamless before the competency hearing on Friday." Mark nodded, a slick, predatory grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, I spoke to the director at Shady Pines. They have a bed ready in the secure ward. Heavy medication protocol. He won't even know what day it is by the time we get to court." I stood perfectly still behind the counter. My hands rested flat on the glass. Shady Pines, the secure ward, heavy medication. They were going to drug me into a stupor so I couldn't string a sentence together in front of the magistrate. I let the silence hang. I took a slow breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I kept my eyes fixed on the glass countertop, watching the reflection of their smug faces. I felt the physical revulsion rising in my throat. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the casual, bureaucratic cruelty of it. They were destroying a human life, and they were talking about it with the same emotional weight as ordering a sandwich. "Well," Judge Sterling said, clapping his hands together, breaking the silence. "I'll leave you two to talk it over. Mark, my office at 8 tomorrow morning. We need to finalize the paperwork for the Gable estate before the probate clerk goes on leave." "I'll be there, Arthur," Mark said. The judge gave me a final, patronizing nod and walked out of the shop. Mark lingered for a moment, looking around the dusty shelves. "Just sign the papers, Dad," Mark said softly, the fake cheerfulness dropping from his voice, replaced by a cold, hard sneer. "Don't make this difficult. You're too old to fight me, and you're too stupid to win. Just fade away." He turned and walked out, the brass bell jingling cheerfully behind him. I stood in the quiet shop for a long time. The smell of the wheat starch paste was suddenly overpowering, mixing with the lingering scent of the judge's peppermint and scotch. I looked down at my hands. The ink stains on my calluses looked like bruises. The Gable estate, Mrs. Gable. She ran the bakery next door. She had been my neighbor for 20 years. Every morning, she brought me a fresh loaf of sourdough and a cup of black coffee. She had a laugh that rattled the windows. She was sharp, fiercely independent, and entirely alone since her husband passed. I hadn't seen her in 3 weeks. Mark had told me she went to Florida to visit her sister. I walked out from behind the counter and locked the front door. I pulled down the shades. I went back to the basement, the chill of the concrete grounding me. I sat at the computer and pulled up the county property records. I searched for Eleanor Gable. The deed had been transferred 14 days ago. The buyer was a shell company, Sterling Holdings. The power of attorney had been signed by Mrs. Gable, witnessed by Mark, and notarized by a woman named Chloe, the same receptionist from Mark's office. I picked up the phone and called the local hospital. I used my old Interpol credentials, bypassing the standard privacy blocks with a routing code Dubois had given me years ago. I asked for the admission records for Eleanor Gable over the last month. The clerk on the other end typed for a moment. "We have an Eleanor Gable admitted 3 weeks ago. Severe concussion. Subdural hematoma. The police report says she had an unfortunate fall down the stairs in her home." "Was she conscious?" I asked, my voice dead flat. "She was in and out," the clerk said, but the attending physician noted she was heavily sedated. Her son, well, the man claiming to be her legal proxy, insisted on maximum pain management. She passed away 2 days later from complications. I hung up the phone. The silence in the basement was absolute. The hum of the servers seemed to fade away. I stared at the glowing monitor, the blue light reflecting in my thick lenses. An unfortunate fall. Maximum pain management. They hadn't just stolen her bakery. They had killed her. I reached out and picked up my brass-handled loop. The metal was cold now. I gripped it tightly, feeling the ridges of the handle biting into my palm. The moral event horizon had been crossed. There was no going back. There was no civil less, no quiet settlement, no gentle correction. This required a public execution. I opened a secure encrypted email client. I attached the network logs, the printer firmware hash, the court dockets, and the hospital records. I addressed it to Dubois, and I CC'd the regional director of the State Police Internal Affairs Division. I typed a single line in the body of the email. "The ink is dry. Bring the handcuffs." I hit send. The next 3 days were a masterclass in psychological warfare. I had to maintain the facade of the slipping, senile old man while Mark finalized his trap. He came to the shop every evening, bringing more papers for me to sign. I pretended to be confused, asking him the same questions over and over. I watched the frustration build in his jaw. I watched him check his watch, calculating how much time he had before the competency hearing. He didn't know that every document he printed in his office was now carrying my invisible signatures. He didn't know that Judge Sterling's desk was piled high with glowing neon confessions. On Thursday night, the night before the hearing, I didn't sleep. I sat at my workbench carefully binding a copy of Dante's Inferno. I stitched the signatures together with heavy linen thread, pulling the needle through the thick paper with a rhythmic, repetitive motion. In and out, in and out. I coated the spine in hot glue, the smell filling the small room. I attached the leather cover, pressing it down with a heavy steel bone folder, smoothing out the air bubbles. It was a perfect binding, strong, unbreakable. Tomorrow, I was going to bind Mark and the judge in the exact same way. Friday morning arrived with a cold gray drizzle. I dressed carefully. I put on my best, albeit frayed, tweed suit. I polished my wire-rimmed glasses until they were perfectly clear. I packed my canvas tote. Inside, I placed my brass loop, a high-lumen 365-nanometer UV forensic flashlight, and a thick leather-bound folder containing the original unaltered deeds to the bookstore. I locked the shop door behind me. I didn't look back at the dusty shelves or the towering stacks of paperbacks. I just turned my collar up against the rain and began the long walk to the county courthouse. The courthouse was a massive, imposing structure of white marble and heavy bronze doors. It smelled of floor polish, wet wool, and nervous sweat. The hallways echoed with the sharp clicks of hard-soled shoes and the low murmur of hushed conversations. I walked slowly, leaning heavily on my wooden cane, playing the part of the frail, terrified old man being led to the slaughter. Mark was waiting for me outside courtroom 302. He was wearing his shiniest suit, his hair slicked back with too much gel. Beside him stood Judge Sterling, looking every bit the stern, impartial arbiter of justice. "You made it," Mark said, his voice dripping with fake relief. "I was worried you'd get lost, Dad." "The bus was late," I mumbled, staring at the floor. Judge Sterling placed a heavy, patronizing hand on my shoulder. "Don't worry, Arthur. This will all be over very soon. The doctors are here to evaluate you, and once we establish that you need a little extra care, Mark will take over the burden of the property. It's for your own good." I looked up at him, letting my eyes water just a bit. "I just want to go back to my books." "I know," Sterling said smoothly. "And you will, in a nice, quiet room." The heavy oak doors of courtroom 302 opened. The bailiff, a massive man with a thick neck and a bored expression, poked his head out, hearing for the estate of Harrison Arthur. "All parties enter." We walked into the courtroom. It was largely empty, save for a court reporter, a clerk sitting at a desk piled high with manila folders, and two men in dark suits sitting in the back row. I didn't recognize them immediately, but I noted the way they sat perfectly still, hands resting on their knees, eyes scanning the room.
State Police, Internal Affairs.
Dubois had come through. Judge Sterling walked up to the bench, his black robe swishing around his ankles. He took his seat, arranging his papers with practiced precision. Mark sat at the plaintiff's table, opening his leather briefcase and pulling out a thick stack of documents. He placed them neatly in front of him, tapping the edges to align them perfectly. I was directed to a small table on the defendant's side. I sat down, placing my canvas tote on the floor beside me. I kept my hands folded in my lap, hiding the ink stains on my calluses. "Let's bring this session to order," Judge Sterling said, his voice booming through the quiet room. He didn't even bother looking at me. "We are here to determine the mental competency of Arthur Harrison and to finalize the transfer of his estate to his son, Mark Harrison, under the previously filed power of attorney. Mark, you may present your evidence." Mark stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He walked to the center of the room, projecting his voice like he was giving a sales pitch. "Your Honor, my father has been suffering from severe cognitive decline for the past 2 years. He is forgetful, easily confused, and incapable of managing his financial affairs. He has signed over power of attorney to me voluntarily, but his condition has worsened to the point where he requires full-time psychiatric care. I have the medical evaluations here, signed by Dr. Aris, as well as the financial documents showing his inability to pay the property taxes. Mark walked over to the clerk's desk and handed over a stack of papers. The clerk stamped them and placed them on the judge's bench. Judge Sterling picked up the papers, flipping through them with barely a glance. "I see the medical evaluations," he said, his tone bored. "And I see the financial records." "Mr. Harrison," he said, finally looking at me, "do you understand what is happening here today?" I stood up slowly, gripping the edge of the table. I let my hands shake. I looked at Mark, then at the judge. I opened my mouth, letting a confused, stammering sound escape my lips. I just want to go home. My books." Mark sighed loudly, rolling his eyes. "You see, Your Honor? He doesn't even know where he is. He's a danger to himself. I have the transport team waiting outside to take him to Shady Pines." Judge Sterling nodded sympathetically. "It is a tragedy to see a mind deteriorate like this. The court recognizes the necessity of intervention. I am prepared to sign the order of incompetency and validate the transfer of the estate." He picked up his pen. The heavy gold-nibbed fountain pen hovered over the final page of the forged power of attorney. This was it. The moment the trap snapped shut, I stopped shaking. I let go of the table and stood up straight. The physical shift in my posture was so sudden, so absolute, that Mark actually took a step back. The manufactured tremor in my hands vanished. I reached up and took off my thick, wire-rimmed reading glasses, folding them neatly and placing them on the table. I looked at Judge Sterling, my eyes clear, sharp, and entirely devoid of confusion. "Put the pen down, Arthur," I said. My voice didn't crack. It didn't waver. It was the cold, hard voice of a man who had interrogated cartel bosses in windowless rooms in Bocata. It echoed off the marble walls of the courtroom, sharp as a cracked whip. Mark stared at me, his mouth falling open. "Dad, what are you doing? Sit down, you're having an episode." I said. "Put the pen down," I repeated, taking a step toward the bench. Judge Sterling froze, the pen hovering an inch above the paper. He frowned, his authoritative mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Mr. Harrison, sit down immediately. The bailiff will restrain you if you do not comply." "You can't validate that document, Arthur," I said, walking slowly toward the center of the room. "Because it's a forgery. And so is every other document Mark has submitted to this court for the last 6 months. Mark let out a nervous, barking laugh. "Your Honor, he's clearly hallucinating. The stress is too much for him. Bailiff, please." The bailiff stepped forward, but I held up a hand. "I wouldn't do that, son. The 2 men in the back row are Lieutenant Miller and Detective Vance from State Police Internal Affairs. If you touch me, you'll be interfering with a federal corruption investigation." The bailiff stopped dead in his tracks, looking toward the back of the room. The 2 men in the dark suits stood up, flashing their badges. Judge Sterling's face went pale. The blood drained from his cheeks, his skin the color of old parchment. "This is an outrage," he sputtered, slamming his hand on the desk. "You are a senile old man running a dusty bookshop. You have no idea what you're talking about." "Mark, get him out of here." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I said. Reaching into my canvas tote, I pulled out my brass-handled loop and the high-lumen UV forensic flashlight. I spent 30 years as the lead forensic document examiner for Interpol. I designed the anti-counterfeiting security layers for the euro, the Swiss franc, and the diplomatic passports of 42 different nations. I can identify microscopic toner discrepancies by eye, and I can tell you exactly what kind of paper a document is printed on by the sound it makes when you fold it. I walked over to the clerk's desk, where Mark had placed his stack of evidence. "You used a flatbed steg scanner to lift my signature from a 2014 lease agreement," I said, picking up the forged power of attorney. "You pasted it into a Word document, but you didn't account for the microkerning. The space between the R and the E in my name is exactly 0.04 millimeters too wide. Furthermore, a wet ink signature bleeds into the paper fibers. This signature is perfectly crisp. It's printed." Mark's face was turning a mottled red. "This is insane. He's crazy. He's making up numbers." "I'm not making up anything," I said. my voice deadly calm. I turned to the stack of files on the clerk's desk. And it's not just my signature, it's the printer. Mark uses an HP LaserJet Enterprise M600 series in his back hallway. The cyan drum unit is flawed. It leaks just enough to leave a ghost image on the bottom margin of every page. An asymmetrical electrostatic toner spray, repeating every 3.2 millimeters. I picked up one of the medical evaluations Mark had submitted. This evaluation, supposedly signed by Dr. Aris, has the exact same cyan ghost image on the bottom margin. It was printed on Mark's machine. Mark forged the doctor's signature too. Judge Sterling stood up, his hands shaking. This is circumstantial nonsense. A toner leak proves nothing. It's the word of a confused, bitter old man against the sworn testimony of his son and a licensed physician. I am signing the order, and I am holding you in contempt. He grabbed his pen again. I wouldn't do that, I said softly. Because you haven't looked at the last 14 estate transfers Mark has submitted to you. The ones you rubber-stamped in under 4 minutes without a hearing. The ones where you took a 30% cut through your Cayman Islands shell company, Sterling Holdings. Sterling dropped the pen. It clattered loudly against the wooden desk. How do you know about that? Because I audit his fake wills, I said. I picked up the thick stack of approved wills sitting on the corner of the clerk's desk. The ones Sterling had already processed. I placed them flat on the table. Mark thought he was so smart, I said, looking directly at my son. He thought I was just a doddering old man who glued spines and drank stale tea. He didn't know that 3 weeks ago, while he was taking a loud, arrogant phone call, in the hallway I walked into his copy room and plugged a custom USB drive into the maintenance port of his printer. Mark's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at the printer in his mind's eye, realizing what I had done. I rewrote the firmware, I continued, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the courtroom. Every piece of paper that has passed through that machine's rollers for the last 21 days has been stamped with a microscopic UV reactive watermark in the cyan channel. It's invisible to the naked eye, but under a 365 nanometer ultraviolet light, it glows. I picked up the heavy steel UV flashlight. I clicked it on. A beam of intense purple light shot across the room, hitting the stack of approved wills on the clerk's desk. Under the ultraviolet light, the pages erupted in stark, undeniable neon green. Across every single page, in bold microscope fire. Fraudulent Digment. Hash. Cud. 884-92 Alpha. The courtroom erupted. The court reporter gasped, dropping her steno machine. The clerk backed away from the desk as if the papers were on fire. Judge Sterling stared at the glowing neon words, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. The pillar of the legal community, the stern guardian of the law, was crumbling in real time. The evidence was undeniable. It was physically embedded into the very fibers of the paper he had used to steal from the elderly. You hacked my machine? Mark whispered, his voice cracking, all the slick arrogance completely gone, replaced by the cowardly fraud he truly was. You ruined me? I didn't ruin you, Mark, I said, turning off the flashlight and plunging the room back into normal lighting. The neon words vanished, but the truth remained burned into the air. You ruined yourself. I just provided the ink. Lieutenant Miller and Detective Vance walked down the center aisle, their handcuffs jingling at their belts. Judge Arthur Sterling, Miller said, his voice loud and clear. You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and accessory to murder. Mark Harrison, you are under arrest for forgery, elder abuse, and murder in the first degree regarding the death of Eleanor Gable. Murder in the first degree. Mark's knees gave out. He collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, sobbing loudly. Judge Sterling stood rigid as Vance spun him around and slapped the cold steel cuffs onto his wrists. The heavy wool suit, the expensive haircut, the smell of peppermint and scotch. It all meant nothing now. He was just a thief in handcuffs. I stood in the center of the courtroom, watching them get led away. I didn't feel joy. I didn't feel triumph. I just felt the heavy, quiet satisfaction of a job finished. The ledger was balanced. The heavy brass handles of the courtroom doors felt cold against my palms as I pushed them open, stepping out into the wide, marble-floored hallway of the county courthouse. The rain was still lashing against the high-arched windows, casting long gray shadows across the polished stone. I stood there for a moment, listening to the muffled sounds of the building. The distant echo of a gavel, the squeak of wet rubber soles, the low hum of the vending machines down the corridor. The adrenaline that had fueled me through the mic drop speech was beginning to recede, leaving behind a deep, hollow ache in my joints. I was 71 years old, and my knees reminded me of it with every shift in barometric pressure. Lieutenant Miller and Detective Vance were flanking Mark and Judge Sterling, marching them toward the service elevators. Mark was sobbing, a pathetic, sniveling sound that bounced off the vaulted ceiling. His slicked-back hair was coming undone, plastering to his forehead in greasy strands. He kept looking back over his shoulder, his eyes wide and bloodshot, searching for me. When he saw me standing by the doors, he stopped struggling against Vance's grip. "Dad!" Mark screamed, his voice cracking into a high, reedy pitch. "Dad, tell them it's a misunderstanding. Tell them you're sick. Tell them you need me. Don't let them take me to county." I didn't say a word. I just watched him. I looked at the man I had taught how to ride a bicycle, the boy I had stayed up with during thunderstorms, the teenager I had bailed out of jail after a stupid, drunk driving stunt. I searched his face for a single ounce of genuine remorse, a flicker of realization about the gravity of what he had done to Mrs. Gable, to the Hendersons, to me. There was nothing. He wasn't crying because he had killed an innocent woman for a bakery. He was crying because his tailored suit was getting wrinkled and he was going to miss his tea time. I let the silence hang between us, thick and suffocating. I took a slow breath, feeling the chill of the damp air fill my lungs, counting the seconds. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I watched the elevator doors slide shut, cutting off his wailing, sealing him inside the steel box. Miller walked back over to me, his expression a mixture of professional stoicism and quiet respect. "We need to process them at the precinct, Mr. Harrison, and we need to execute the search warrants on your son's office and the judge's chambers. You're the primary complainant and our key forensic witness. Do you want to come down to the station, or should we call you a car?" "I'll ride with you," I said, my voice raspy. "I want to see the books." The ride to the precinct was quiet. The cruiser smelled of stale sweat, vinyl, and the sharp tang of pepper spray. I sat in the back, the wire mesh digging slightly into my shoulder, watching the city blur past the rain-streaked window. We pulled into the underground garage, the harsh fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. They brought Mark and Sterling in through the loading dock to avoid the press. The booking area was a chaotic symphony of ringing phones, shouting desk sergeants, and the clanking of heavy metal doors. They stripped Mark of his shiny suit, his Rolex, his Italian leather shoes. They handed him a crumpled orange jumpsuit that was 2 sizes too big. Watching him pull the rough cotton over his head was like watching a snake shed its skin, only to reveal a smaller, uglier snake underneath. Without the armor of his wealth, he looked small. He looked exactly like the coward he was. They put him in interrogation room B. They put Judge Sterling in interrogation room A. Miller led me down a narrow, cinder-block hallway to the observation deck. The room was dark, lit only by the glow of the monitoring equipment and the harsh white light spilling through the two-way glass into the interrogation rooms. I pulled up a folding metal chair and sat down. The seat was hard and unforgiving. Detective Vance handed me a styrofoam cup of precinct coffee. It was lukewarm, bitter, and tasted faintly of burnt plastic and copper. I took a sip anyway, letting the heat ground me. In room B, Mark was pacing. He was running his hands through his hair, muttering to himself, kicking the leg of the bolted-down steel table. In room A, Judge Sterling was sitting perfectly still, his arms crossed over his chest, staring at the wall with the arrogant entitlement of a man who believed his country club connections would have him out in an hour. Vance walked into room A first. I watched through the glass as he dropped a thick manila folder onto the table. The slap of the cardboard against the steel was loud enough to hear through the audio feed. "Arthur Sterling," Vance said, sitting down and leaning forward. "You're looking at 20 to life for conspiracy, extortion, and accessory to murder. The state is prepared to offer you a deal, but only if you give us the rest of the network. We know about the shell companies. We know about the 30% cut. We know you've been rubber stamping Mark Harrison's forged documents for 6 months." Sterling let out a dry, dismissive laugh. "This is a witch hunt orchestrated by a senile, vindictive old man who doesn't understand how the legal system works. My signature on those dockets is a matter of judicial discretion. The UV watermark is a parlor trick. No judge in the appellate court will convict a sitting magistrate based on invisible ink and the ramblings of a disgruntled family member. I want my lawyer." Vance didn't blink. He opened the folder and slid a piece of paper across the table. "That's the financial ledger from Sterling Holdings. We seized the servers from your accountant's office 20 minutes ago. We have the wire transfers. We have the emails where you explicitly told Mark to accelerate the Gable woman's decline because she was contesting the property line. You didn't just rubber stamp the paperwork, Arthur. You ordered the hit." Sterling's face went rigid. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a wax figure left too close to a fire. He stared at the ledger, his mouth opening and closing silently. The pillar of the community was crumbling, brick by brick, right in front of my eyes. Vance leaned in closer. "Mark is in the next room, and he's talking. He's telling us everything. He's telling us how you threatened to disbar him if he didn't give you a bigger cut of the Miller estate. If you want to beat the murder charge, you need to start talking right now, before your boy throws you under the bus to save his own skin." It was the classic prisoner's dilemma, executed with surgical precision. I took another sip of the terrible coffee. Have you ever looked at someone you raised, someone you taught how to tie their shoes and shave their face, and realized they were entirely hollow inside? Not evil in a grand, theatrical way, just empty. Just a void that needed to be filled with other people's money and status. It makes you wonder where the wiring went wrong. Did I spoil him? Did I work too many hours at the Interpol labs, leaving him alone with his mother? Or was he just born with a rusted soul? If you were sitting in my chair right now, looking through that two-way glass at your own flesh and blood, watching him realize his life was over, would you feel a twinge of pity? Would you feel a father's grief? Or would you just take another sip of bad coffee and watch him drown? I felt nothing. The ink on my hands was dry. The ledger was balanced. In room B, Miller walked in and sat opposite Mark. Mark immediately leaned forward, his voice muffled but frantic through the speakers. "You have to listen to me," Mark pleaded, his hands shaking so badly he had to clasp them together on the table. "My dad is crazy. He's been crazy for years. He hacked my printer. He planted that stuff. The judge made me do it. Sterling threatened me. He said if I didn't bring him the estates, he'd ruin my development company. I'm a victim here." Miller just stared at him, his face a mask of stone. "Mark, we have you on tape in the bookstore bragging about how you and the judge killed Eleanor Gable. We have the hospital records showing you ordered the heavy sedation. We have the UV watermarks on the murder weapon, the forged will. You're not a victim, you're a predator. And right now, the man who built the cage is sitting in the next room, deciding whether to throw away the key." Mark swallowed hard, his eyes darting to the two-way mirror. He knew I was behind it. He could feel it. "Dad?" he whispered to the glass. "Dad, please, I'm your son." I set the styrofoam cup down on the metal counter. I stood up, my joints popping in the quiet room. "I'm going to the office," I told Miller. "I need to see the physical teardown. I need to make sure they don't miss the secondary hard drives." Miller nodded. "I'll drive you. Vance can handle the confessions. They're both cracking. It's just a matter of who breaks first." The drive to Mark's downtown real estate office was a blur of red taillights and wet asphalt. When we arrived, the street was already cordoned off with yellow police tape. 2 cruisers were parked on the sidewalk, their light bars flashing silently against the glass facade of the building. The forensic team was already inside, tearing the place apart. I walked through the glass doors. The reception area was a mess. Chloe, the young receptionist, was sitting on a plush leather sofa, crying into a tissue while a uniformed officer took her statement. She looked up when I walked in, her eyes red and puffy. "Mr. Harrison," she sniffled, wiping her nose. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know what he was doing. He told me we were helping old people manage their estates. He told me the notary stamps were just administrative shortcuts. I walked over to her, my worn slippers silent on the carpet. I reached into my tweed cardigan and pulled out a clean, cotton handkerchief. I handed it to her. "I know, Chloe. You were just a kid doing a job. But you need to tell the detectives everything you saw." Every time he brought in an old person who looked confused. Every time he locked his door. "Don't hold anything back." She nodded, clutching the handkerchief. "He kept a second set of books," she whispered, leaning in close so the officer wouldn't hear. "In the floor safe behind the ficus plant in his private office. He thought nobody knew the combination, but I saw him type it in once. It's his dog's birthday, 0412. I gave her a small, sad smile. "Thank you, Chloe." I walked down the back hallway, past the copy room where I had planted the USB drive. The forensic team had already bagged the HP LaserJet. It sat on the table, wrapped in thick plastic, looking like a corpse on a slab. I walked into Mark's private office. It was a shrine to unearned success. Mahogany desk, abstract art that cost more than my shop. A wet bar stocked with top-shelf scotch. Miller was already in there, kneeling by a large potted ficus tree in the corner. He pushed the heavy ceramic pot aside, revealing a small digital floor safe embedded in the concrete. He punched in 0412. The lock beeped and clicked open. Inside, there were no stacks of cash, just 3 thick black ledgers and a handful of encrypted USB drives. Miller pulled out the first ledger and flipped it open. He let out a low whistle. "Mother of God." "Harrison, look at this." I walked over and looked down at the page. It was a meticulous, handwritten log of every predatory loan Mark had taken out, every bribe he had paid, and every property he had stolen. But it wasn't just local elderly people. The names went on for pages. The Hendersons, the Millers, the Gables, and at the bottom of the page a new entry dated yesterday. "Harrison, Arthur, Bookstore lease, 99-year, 500,000 hard money loan. Lender, Varga." I stared at the name, Varga. I knew that name. Interpol had a file on him 3 inches thick. Tomas Varga wasn't just a local loan shark. He was a mid-level money launderer for an Eastern European syndicate. He used predatory hard money loans to wash dirty cash, foreclosing on properties and flipping them to shell companies. Mark hadn't just borrowed money from a bank. He had borrowed $500,000 from a ruthless criminal enterprise, using my bookstore as collateral. "Miller," I said, my voice deadly quiet, "you need to put a detail on the shop. Varga doesn't use the courts to collect his debts. When he finds out Mark is in county and the collateral is tied up in a police investigation, he's going to come for the building. And he's going to come for me." Miller closed the ledger, his jaw set. "I'll put a cruiser on the block. But Harrison, if Varga is involved, this goes way beyond elder abuse. This is organized crime. You need to go into protective custody." "No," I said, shaking my head. "I'm not hiding in a safe house. I spent 30 years hunting men like Varga. If I run, he burns the shop down with my life's work inside it. I'm going back to the bookstore. I'm going to wait for him, and I'm going to finish this." Miller looked at me, seeing the cold, hard resolve in my eyes. He didn't argue. He just nodded. "Keep your phone on. If he shows up, you call 911 and you get out the back door. Do you understand?" "I understand," I said. They drove me back to the shop as the sun began to set, casting long, bruised purple shadows across the wet pavement. The police cruiser parked discreetly down the alley, its lights off. I unlocked the heavy oak door, stepped inside, and flipped the sign to closed. The bell jingled, a cheerful sound that felt entirely out of place. The shop was exactly as I had left it. The smell of decaying lignin, the dust motes dancing in the fading light, the heavy silence of 1,000 unread books. I walked behind the counter, took off my tweed cardigan, and hung it on the brass hook. I rolled up my sleeves, exposing the faded ink stains that mapped my forearms like tattoos. I didn't have to wait long. At 9 p.m., the heavy thud of boots echoed on the wooden porch outside. The brass bell didn't jingle. The door was kicked open, the wood splintering around the lockpick with a loud crack. 3 men walked in. They were built like refrigerators, wearing cheap leather jackets and smelling of wet tobacco and violence. In the center was Tomas Varga. He was a short, barrel-chested man with a scarred lip and eyes that looked like dead black stones. He held a heavy steel crowbar in his right hand, tapping it rhythmically against his thigh. "Arthur Harrison," Varga said, his voice a thick, gravelly rasp. "Your boy, Mark, is in a cage. He owes me 500 grand. The collateral is this building. But the cops put a lien on it. I don't like liens. I like cash." I didn't flinch. I didn't reach for the phone. I just stood behind the counter, my hands resting flat on the glass. "Mark forged my signature to get that loan, Varga. The contract is void. The police have the proof." Varga laughed, a wet, ugly sound. He walked up to the counter and slammed the crowbar down on the glass. A spiderweb fracture bloomed under the steel, right over a first edition of Hemingway. "I don't care about the cops," Varga snarled, leaning in close. "I care about my money. You're going to sign the deed over to my holding company tonight. Or I'm going to break your hands, burn this place to the ground, and take the ashes." I looked at the crowbar. I looked at the fracture in the glass. I felt the cold, mechanical clarity settle over my brain. The Interpol ghost wasn't just a document examiner. I was a man who knew where the bodies were buried in 50 different countries. "You're a sloppy launderer, Tomas," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Varga blinked, his smile faltering. "What did you say, old man?" I said, "You're sloppy," I repeated louder this time. I reached under the counter. Varga's men tensed, reaching for their waistbands. But I didn't pull a gun. I pulled out my brass-handled loop and a thick black notebook. I tossed the notebook onto the fractured glass. 3 years ago, you wired €2 million from a casino in Macau to a shell company in Cyprus, I said, opening the notebook. The routing number was 884992. You thought you bounced the signal through 3 different servers in the Caymans to hide it. But you made a microkerning error on the digital transfer authorization. You used a standard Arial font instead of the bank's proprietary serif. The automated fraud flag caught it, but your buddy in the compliance department buried the alert for a $50,000 bribe. Varga's face went pale. The crowbar slipped slightly in his grip. "How do you know that?" "Because I was the one who designed the security protocol that flagged the font discrepancy," I said, looking him dead in the eyes. "I know about the Macau Casino. I know about the Cyprus account, and I know that the Russian syndicate you work for doesn't tolerate skimmed money. If I send this notebook to your bosses in Moscow, they won't just kill you, Tomas. They'll peel you like an onion." The silence in the shop was absolute. The 2 goons looked at Varga, confusion and fear creeping into their eyes. They didn't know I was a retired forensic expert. They just saw an old man who somehow knew their boss's deepest, darkest secrets. Varga swallowed hard. The arrogant sneer was completely gone, replaced by the terrified realization that he was standing in a room with a predator far older and far more dangerous than he was. "The debt is void," I said, closing the notebook. "You will file the paperwork to release the lien on this property by tomorrow morning. If you don't, or if any of you ever step foot on my street again, I will mail this book to Moscow. Do we have an understanding?" Vargas stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. Then, slowly, he nodded. He picked up the crowbar, turned around, and walked out the door, his men trailing closely behind him. They didn't say a word. They just disappeared into the rainy night. I stood in the quiet shop, listening to the rain tap against the windows. I let out a long, shaky breath, the adrenaline finally leaving my system. I walked over to the door, pulled it shut as best as I could, and slid the deadbolt into place. I went down to the basement, to my workbench. I sat in the leather chair, the hum of the servers wrapping around me like a heavy blanket. I picked up my brass loop, rubbing my thumb over the smooth metal. The next morning, Detective Vance came to the shop. He looked exhausted, his tie loosened, his eyes ringed with dark circles. He sat on a stool by the counter, drinking a cup of the stale black tea I had brewed. "They both broke," Vance said, blowing on the hot tea. "Sterling gave us the entire network. We've arrested 4 more lawyers, 2 notaries, and a doctor. Mark is facing 3-count first-degree murder, 12 counts of forgery, and elder abuse. He's looking at life without parole. The judge is looking at 20 years in federal prison for the RICO charges alone." I nodded, wiping down the glass counter with a soft cotton cloth. "And the victims? We're reversing the property transfers," Vance said. "The estates are going back to the rightful heirs. Mrs. Gable's niece is getting the bakery back. It's a massive victory, Harrison. You took down a whole ring." Vance took a sip of the tea, then set the mug down. He looked at me, his expression turning serious. "But I need to ask you something off the record," Vance said, leaning forward. "We went through Mark's print logs. We saw the timestamps. You hacked his printer 3 weeks ago. You knew he was forging the wills. You knew he was targeting the Hendersons and the Millers. You could have stopped him after the first one. You could have gone to the police then." I stopped wiping the counter. I kept my eyes on the glass. "You let him keep going," Vance continued, his voice low and probing. "You let him forge a dozen more documents. You let him push Mrs. Gable down the stairs and medicate her to death, just so you could build a bigger case, just so you could bury the judge along with your son. You traded those other old folks' peace of mind, and maybe even their lives, to build a flawless trap. Do you sleep okay with that, Harrison? Knowing you could have stopped the bleeding, but you let it run to catch the bigger fish." I let the silence hang in the dusty air of the shop. I took a slow breath, smelling the old paper, the binding glue, the stale tea. I looked at the ink stains on my calloused fingers. I thought about Mrs. Gable's laugh. I thought about the heavy, unearned gloss of the judge's suit. I thought about the cold, hard math of justice. I looked up at Vance. I looked up at Vance. The steam from his stale black tea curled into the cold air of the shop, twisting like the very lies my son had spun. I didn't answer him right away. I let the silence hang, heavy and thick, listening to the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. I took a slow breath, feeling the familiar comforting scent of decaying lignin and binding glue fill my lungs. "You look at a forest fire, detective, and you see the trees burning," I said, my voice low, scraping against the quiet of the room. "You see the immediate destruction. But if you don't let it burn down to the firebreak, if you try to smother it while it's still small and hidden in the brush, it goes underground. It becomes a peat fire. It smolders for years, eating the roots, and when the wind changes, it comes back and takes the whole mountain." I picked up my brass-handled loop, turning it over in my ink-stained fingers. The metal was cool, solid, real. Mark wasn't just a bad seat. He was a symptom of a rot that went all the way down to the bedrock of this county's legal system. If I had stopped him at the Henderson estate, if I had gone to the police with a single forged power of attorney, Sterling would have buried it. He would have called it a clerical error, thrown Mark a slap on the wrist, and then they would have just moved to a different printer, a different judge, a different vulnerable, old woman. Mrs. Gable's death, That was the firebreak. That was the tragedy that forced the state to look at the ash and realize the whole forest was infected. Vance stared at me, his jaw tight. He didn't like the math. Cops rarely do. They like clear lines between the good guys and the bad guys. They don't like the gray area where you have to let a monster eat to prove he has teeth. It's a heavy ledger to balance, Harrison, Vance said softly, standing up and buttoning his damp wool coat. I hope the math works out for you when you're lying in bed at night. The ink is dry, detective, I replied, not breaking eye contact. I sleep just fine. He nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion, and walked out the door. The brass bell jingled, a bright, cheerful sound that felt entirely disconnected from the heavy reality left in his wake. I stood behind the counter for a long time, watching the dust motes drifting in the fading afternoon light, listening to the rain tap against the glass. 2 days later, the shop phone rang. It was a heavy, black, Bakelite rotary phone that sat on the corner of my workbench. It didn't trill or chirp. It let out a harsh, mechanical shriek that vibrated through the wood and straight into my bones. I wiped my hands on a rag, smelling the sharp tang of the hide glue I had been heating, and picked up the receiver. Mr. Harrison? The voice on the other end was slick, fast, and dripping with the kind of manufactured urgency that only high-priced defense attorneys can muster. This is Richard Sterling! No relation to the judge, I assure you. I'm representing your son, Mark. I'm calling because we have a slight situation at the county lockup. I didn't say a word. I just listened to the faint static hum of the line. Mark is in protective custody, but the guards are stretched thin. The lawyer continued, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper. Word on the yard is that some of the men he owed money to on the outside have cousins on the inside. He's terrified, Mr. Harrison. He's not eating. He's asking for you. The judge set bail at $250,000. I know the shop is tied up in probate, but if you can leverage the 99-year lease, we can get a bondsman to front it. He needs to come home, Arthur. He's your boy. I looked down at my hands. The calluses on my fingertips were thick, built up from 30 years of pulling linen thread through heavy cardstock. I thought about the way Mark had looked at me in the courtroom, not with remorse, but with the sheer, unadulterated fury of a thief who had been caught picking the wrong lock. I thought about Mrs. Gable lying in a hospital bed, heavily sedated, her skull fractured, while my son signed the papers to sell her bakery. Mr. Harrison, are you there? The lawyer pressed. I need an answer. The bondsman is waiting. I let the silence hang. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I listened to the lawyer's breathing, the faint sound of a precinct phone ringing in the background of his office. You have the wrong number, I said, my voice flat, devoid of any tremor or emotion. I don't have a son. I hung up the heavy Bakelite receiver. The mechanical click of the plunger, disconnecting the call, echoed in the quiet shop. I didn't feel a surge of triumph. I didn't feel a pang of guilt. I just felt the profound, hollow relief of a man who has finally amputated a gangrenous limb. The rot was gone. The bleeding had stopped. The next 6 months were a blur of depositions, asset liquidations, and the slow grinding machinery of the justice system. The state moved with a terrifying efficiency once the UV watermarks and the financial ledgers were entered into evidence. Judge Sterling's trial was a media circus. I didn't attend. I didn't need to see him in an orange jumpsuit to know he was broken. The newspaper said he sat in the courtroom, staring blankly at the wall. His expensive suits replaced by county cotton, his arrogant sneer replaced by the hollow 1,000-yard stare of a man who knows he will die in a concrete box. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison consecutive for the RICO and extortion charges. The murder charges were handled at the state level, adding another life sentence. The pillar of the community had been reduced to rubble. Mark's trial was quieter, but no less brutal. I sat in the back row of the gallery on the day of his sentencing. The courtroom smelled of floor wax and nervous sweat. the exact same smell as the competency hearing, but the power dynamic had entirely inverted. Mark looked small at the defense table. The slicked-back hair was gone, replaced by a jagged, uneven buzz cut. The tailored suits were a memory. He wore a wrinkled gray suit that hung loosely on his frame, the result of losing 30 pounds in county lockup. When the judge read the verdict guilty on all counts, including 3 counts of first-degree felony murder, Mark didn't scream. He didn't cry. He just slumped forward, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic sobs. The judge handed down life, without the possibility of parole. As the bailiffs hauled him up and led him toward the holding cells, he looked back at the gallery. His eyes found mine in the back row. I didn't look away. I didn't offer a comforting nod, and I didn't glare with hatred. I just looked at him with the cold, clinical detachment of a forensic examiner looking at a flawed document. He was a forgery, a cheap, poorly executed copy of a human being, and now he was being filed away in the archives where he belonged. With Mark and Sterling in prison, the legal tangle of the stolen estates began to unravel. The court appointed a special master to reverse the fraudulent property transfers. The Hendersons got their home back. The Millers recovered their savings. And Mrs. Gable's niece, a quiet woman named Sarah, who lived 2 states over, inherited the bakery next door. She came to the shop a week after the probate cleared, bringing a warm loaf of sourdough and a cup of black coffee, just like her aunt used to. We sat on the porch eating the bread in silence, the crust cracking loudly in the crisp autumn air. It wasn't a replacement for the loss, but it was a start. But the biggest piece of the puzzle was the bookstore itself. The 99-year lease was entirely in my name, free and clear of Mark's predatory liens. Tomas Varga had kept his word. The hard money loan was legally voided, erased from the county records, as if it had never existed. The building, sitting on a highly coveted piece of downtown real estate, was suddenly worth millions to commercial developers. I had men in sharp suits knocking on my door every day. They offered me buyouts that would have let me retire to a villa in Tuscany. They talked about tearing down the dusty shelves, gutting the interior, and turning the space into a high-end artisanal coffee shop or a boutique fitness studio. They looked at my frayed tweed cardigan and my ink-stained hands and saw a doddering old man who would jump at the chance to cash out. They didn't understand the paper. They didn't understand the memory of the building. I called a meeting with the director of the State Historical Preservation Trust. We sat at my workbench, surrounded by the smell of hot hide glue and old parchment. I laid out my terms. I wasn't selling the building. I was donating the physical structure and the land to the trust, establishing a permanent ironclad endowment for its maintenance. In exchange, I retained a lifetime, rent-free lease on the ground floor for the bookstore and the small apartment in the back. The trust would protect the building from developers in perpetuity, and I would protect the books. The director, a sharp-eyed woman who appreciated a well-structured contract, signed the papers without hesitation. The physical labor of securing the shop fell entirely on me. I was 71, and my back ached with a dull, persistent throb every time it rained, but I refused to hire movers for the rare collections. I spent 3 weeks carefully wrapping the first editions in acid-free tissue paper, packing them into custom-built wooden crates. I moved the heavy cast-iron book press inch by inch across the floorboards, my calloused hands gripping the cold steel, my boots slipping slightly on the sawdust. I relined the shelves, sanding down the rough wood and applying a fresh coat of linseed oil. The smell of the oil, rich and earthy, mixed with the vanilla tang of the decaying lignin, creating a scent that was entirely my own. It was the smell of survival. Winter came early that year, blanketing the city in a thick, muffling layer of white snow. The chaotic noise of the streets was dampened, replaced by the quiet crunch of boots and the distant rumble of snowplows. Inside the shop it was warm. I had upgraded from the stale black tea to a loose-leaf Earl Grey, the fragrant steam curling up from my mug as I sat at my workbench. The shop was quiet, but it wasn't empty. The Historical Trust had funded a complete restoration of the reading room. We had installed warm, amber-toned reading lamps, plush leather armchairs, and heavy oak tables. The regulars had returned, and new faces had started to drift in. Young students, retired professors, people looking for a quiet sanctuary away from the glowing screens and digital noise of the modern world. They would sit for hours, turning the heavy, textured pages of the books, breathing in the dust and the history. I was currently working on a mid-19th century edition of Dante's Inferno. The spine was completely detached, the original leather cracked and flaking like dry skin. I had carefully stripped away the old glue, a painstaking process that required a steady hand and a surgeon's precision. I was applying a fresh layer of hot hide glue to the linen tape, the sharp animal tang of the adhesive, filling the small space around my workbench. I pressed the heavy brass bone folder along the seam, smoothing out the air bubbles, feeling the satisfying tacky resistance of the materials bonding together. There is a profound, quiet justice in bookbinding. You take something that is broken, something that has been torn apart by time and neglect, and you stitch it back together. You reinforce the weak points. You give it a new spine, a new strength, so it can stand on the shelf and face the world again. It's a slow, methodical process. There are no shortcuts. You can't forge a good binding, just like you can't forge a good life. Eventually, the stress will test the seams, and the cheap glue will fail. I set the bone folder down and picked up my mug of tea, taking a slow sip. The warmth spread through my chest, chasing away the chill of the winter draft slipping through the window frames. I looked out at the shop, at the towering shelves, at the dust motes floating in the amber light of the reading lamps. I'd spent 30 years hunting for microscopic flown passports and currency, looking for the tiny, hidden lies that criminals tried to pass off as the truth. I had spent the last year dissecting the lies of my own flesh and blood. Now, my eyes were tired. I just wanted to look at things that were real. People ask me if I feel guilty. They ask if the ghost of my son visits me when the shop is closed and the shadows stretch long across the floorboards. The truth is, the ghost died a long time ago. The boy I raised was replaced by a stranger in a shiny suit. A man who looked at a vulnerable old woman and saw nothing but a line item on a spreadsheet. I don't mourn the stranger. I mourn the boy, and I laid that boy to rest the moment I plugged that USB drive into the printer. I picked up the brass-handled loop, turning it over in my hands. I don't use it to catch forgers anymore. I use it to examine the intricate tooling on 18th century leather covers, to appreciate the microscopic details of the craftsmanship that the naked eye misses. The world is full of hidden details, if you know how to look for them. I leaned back in my leather chair, the springs creaking softly in the quiet shop. If you're sitting out there listening to this, maybe you're driving home from a job that grinds your bones to dust. Or maybe you're sitting on your own porch, looking at a family tree that's got some rot in the branches. We're taught from a young age that blood is thicker than water. We're told that family is sacred, that you forgive, that you turn the other cheek, that you absorb the poison to keep the peace. But I've spent my life in studying the structural integrity of materials. And I can tell you, when a beam is compromised, when the rot reaches the core, it doesn't matter how much you love the house. If you don't cut the bad wood out, the whole roof comes down on your head. Have you ever had to make that cut? Have you ever had to look at someone who shares your DNA, someone you were supposed to protect, and realize that the only way to save yourself was to hand them the rope and let them hang? It's a lonely thing, sitting in the quiet after the execution. The silence is heavy, but it's a clean silence. It's the silence of a ledger that finally balances. If you've ever had to sever a toxic tie to save your own foundation, if you've ever had to play the fool to catch a king, hit the like button. Let the algorithm know that the quiet ones are still out here watching, waiting, and keeping the records. Subscribe to the channel for more stories from the workbench, more deep dives into the mechanics of justice and the cold, hard math of revenge. And I want to hear from you. Go down to the comments right now and tell me, when the people who are supposed to love you turn out to be the predators, is there a line they can cross where forgiveness is no longer an option? Or is holding on to the grudge just drinking poison and expecting the other guy to die? Where is your moral event horizon? Let's argue about it in the comments. I'm going to get back to this Dante binding. The glue is setting, and the leather needs to be pressed before the winter air dries it out. Stay sharp, keep your eyes open, and never let them tell you that you're too old to read the fine print.